Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone that is joining us, thank you so much for making time on your Sunday afternoon to join this another wonderful episode of Sunday Sit-In. My name is Janaea Luck, and I'm with AARP's Virginia State Office. And I'm just so honored to be able to sponsor and continue the partnership with the Richmond chapter of ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And AARP Virginia has been working with Richmond ASALH for a while and supporting a lot of wonderful virtual events, and we are looking forward to working together in person very soon. AARP Virginia has a wonderful, wonderful group of volunteers, and our volunteers just really bring such passion and energy to everything that we do at AARP. And it's my honor to turn it over to our AARP Community Ambassador, Michelle Evans Oliver, who's also the president of the Richmond chapter of ASALH. So turning it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Janaea. It's always been an honor to work with AARP Virginia, and to bring the ASALH Richmond and AARP partnership together has been a great support and partnership over the past few years. And we look forward to doing many more things with AARP Virginia. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining the ASALH Richmond Sunday Sit-Ins that is sponsored by AARP Virginia. My name is Michelle Evans Oliver, and I am the president of ASALH. And for all of you all who aren't familiar with what ASALH stands for, as Janaea said earlier, it's the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We were founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1915, and the ASALH Richmond branch was founded in 2020. We have been doing webinars through this pandemic, and we have a Sunday sit-ins that we have been working on for the past year and a half. And this Sunday sit-ins is once a month, the fourth Sunday of the month at 5 o'clock. And we'll discuss important topics. Today, our important topic is downsizing and decluttering to uncover our family history with retired librarian and genealogist, Linda Chrysler White. Throughout this presentation, we will be utilizing the chat feature and the Q&A feature at the bottom. If you have questions, please put those questions in the Q&A. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you see two bubbles and it says Q&A. Click on that and it'll open and you'll be able to ask your question. And we will also utilize the chat just to chat and have conversation. We can now try to use this chat. I see people are still logging on. So if you can go to the chat feature at the bottom, click on it and say where you're from and what organization you're with, or where you found out about us, whether it be AARP Virginia, whether it be the ASALH Richmond email, or any other genealogical organization that you could be a part of, or any organization that you could be a part of. And so let's see what we have here. Open up my chat. We have some people from Michigan. I see AARP Pennsylvania. Hello from South Carolina, AARP. San Antonio, Texas. Thanks for joining us, everyone. So this is where the fun begins. We have Maryland, we have Ohio, ASALH Richmond, New York, Florida, New Jersey. Oh, they're going to keep coming in. And I'm going to keep talking throughout this presentation, giving shouts to different organizations and places. So thank you again for joining us. So now, please like us on Facebook. And we are at Facebook, ASALH RVA. I'll put that in there. And think about joining our mailing list where you can get our most up-to-the-date information. We're always looking for members too. So I'll put that information in as well. So as stated earlier, we are with Sunday Sit-Ins and we have Linda Chrysler White with us. Now, I met Linda through a PBS show called Legacy List. I was helping the PBS show find cast members to cast on legacy lists. And we were fortunate enough to have Linda and her husband, Eric, and I had that episode, and I'll put it in the chat so you can look at it later. But that's where I met Linda a few years ago. And if you don't know what Legacy List is, Legacy List is a program that takes a look at our homes and the hidden treasures and heirlooms and precious memories to be found within them. But to give you a little bit more about Linda Critchlow White, she's a native Washingtonian, a retired school librarian, and former home economics teacher. And she became interested in genealogy in 2006 after discovering a cache of photos and documents, and soon published a book called Back There Then, a compilation of stories and images from family members. Linda volunteers at the National Museum of African American History and Culture and is currently the president of the James Dent Walker, Washington, D.C. chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. She and her husband, Eric, as I said earlier, were recently able to share some of their family history on the PBS show Legacy List. It's a great show. Linda has given many lectures on history and genealogy and is also a member of NGS and the New England Historical and Genealogical Society. She's proud to have articles published in the American Ancestors magazine and Og's newsletter. Now I'm going to stop with all of this, and I want to turn this over to Linda Critchlow White. Thank you for being here. It's on you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And Michelle, you made it a point to say that you met Eric and me on Legacy List. Everybody, it was because of Michelle that we were able to appear on Legacy List. So that's a story in itself that I might touch on later in the presentation, but if you have questions about Legacy List, then feel free to ask. So everybody can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to talk about today is getting stuff out of our attics and basements and into a proper repository. So this was billed as a discussion kind of about downsizing. So it's going to be a little bit about downsizing, but what I'm mostly going to talk about is this: a collection of photos that we found and later donated to Northeastern University, some family papers that we later donated to the Schlesinger Library, and some things that have transpired since we first found the manuscripts and pictures, and the importance of placing family memorabilia into appropriate repositories, and a little bit about appraisal and tax benefits of donating. So this talk will not really be about what to do with clothing, furniture, kitchenware, and all that other stuff that we have accumulated over the years. And I do believe that sometimes we actually have to close our eyes and just let somebody haul certain things away. Oops. So how to begin downsizing. One suggestion is to call a senior move manager. There's an organization called the National Association of Specialty and Senior Move Managers. You also might want to consult someone from the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals. Their websites are listed, and I will make these websites available to Michelle, who will later send you out all these links. Interestingly, where it says Senior Move Manager, that organization name has just changed over the last year or so, because they realized that a lot of the things that seniors needed help with, everybody who moves needs help with. Same thing with professional organizers. I have been using professional organizers for a long time. And the organization used to be called National Association of Professional Organizers, but now it's National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals. But in the meantime, if you have someone, or if you have things that you think might be historically valuable, it's a good idea to talk to someone at your local museum, public library, or historical society. Those places will give you like free advice. And it's also a good idea to visit those places just to see what kind of materials are in their collections. And you can visit in person, but you can also go to their websites. Another really important thing is to make a list of what you have. and determine the who, how, what, where, and when of materials you have. So Michelle said that I was a school librarian, and for sure, when we taught students research skills, it was helping them to research properly. You're asking questions. Who am I researching? How am I going to do this research? What am I looking for? Where is the information? And when, like what is the date? And when you're looking at your materials, if necessary, prepare a timeline. You want to label photos and other items if you haven't already done so. I already said you should visit museums, but also house museums. And I have an image here of the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House. It's here in Washington. In Richmond, who has the famous house that's on display? Help me out with the name. Everybody should answer. Maggie Walker, who's been to the Maggie Walker house? And by the way, I know people in this group today are from all over the country, but if you ever get to Richmond, you got to visit the Maggie Walker house. She is one of the first women, if not the first Black woman to own a bank. And it is still in existence in some form today. But these places have examples of the kinds of things you might have in your house that another place might be able to use at some point. So you can attend antiquarian shows such as antiquarian bookstores or book shows. Even viewing Antiques Roadshow can help. And then I put a note, read children's illustrated books. I think that one of the reasons I kind of knew to save certain things when I had the responsibility of cleaning homes, because I had read all these books, not that many, but there's some children's books that have illustrations of the times. And I'm sorry I don't have an illustration of one of those books today. You all remember the American Girl dolls, and those dolls came with books, or you could buy the books separately. Those books were geared toward girls, of course, young children, but they had a lot of images of life as it was during the period of that particular doll or child's life. So that's why I say read children's illustrated books. So here are the types of donations that we can give: artifacts and manuscripts. So what's the value of manuscripts and artifacts? They permit scholars and others to reconstruct and understand the past, interpret the national character, and set the record straight about events and personalities that are otherwise shrouded in mystery and steeped in controversy. For instance, one of my pet peeves is I hear so many speakers, Black and white, all over the country say, well, Black people couldn't do this, Black people couldn't do that at certain periods in time. But when we look at our family history, we see, well, maybe they could. Like I hear people say about Washington, Black people couldn't get loans to buy houses. Well, let's say in Richmond, they would go to Maggie Walker's bank and get a loan to buy a house. So for instance, I have seen the deeds of my family dating back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they were able to get loans, even from some mainstream banks, to buy houses. So when you're cleaning out a home, your parents, grandparents' homes, look out for these things because they help to set the record straight. So other types of personal manuscripts are letters and correspondence, vital records, deeds, which I just mentioned, obituary files, newspaper clippings, and more. And I will mention when we did a program with Asala a few months ago, we had with us Lillian Lambert, who had attended Harvard, and she was able to donate her papers, her business papers, to Harvard. So I'm not going to be talking too much about business papers, but it's all these kinds of things that have value. So what are your responsibilities? What are your options? What is the process? Where do you start to get things out of your home and into a proper repository? So your responsibility, of course, is to conserve it, preserve it, and share it. And it's the institution's responsibility to preserve, protect, and promote. Once you donate to a repository, the materials hopefully will be handled with care and properly stored. The future availability for research is assured, almost. Although please understand, once a repository accepts a donation, depending on what's in the gift deed, they are not necessarily bound to hold the items forever into perpetuity. Just keep that in mind. But also, while they are there, the materials are accessible to researchers and scholars. So what exactly is a repository? A place, a building, a central location where an aggregation of selected information is stored. And some of the types of repositories, of course, are libraries, museums, historical societies, and archives. Now, keep in mind for archives, when we are, let's take a place like the National Archives and Records Administration here in Washington, or the State Archives of Virginia. For the most part, they only house government records or records that have been generated by the federal government. Although I believe, I know this is for sure, at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, they do accept personal papers. Similarly, the museum in Tennessee State Museum and Archives. So I'm just saying that to say, check and see, because every institution is different. So other options, of course, are to trash it, throw it away. How many of you know of situations where valuable materials were thrown away after somebody passed away, moved, or otherwise? I've even heard stories of where someone has told someone, I want that, but please let me have those papers. Let me have those pictures, but they end up getting thrown away anyway. So when things are thrown away, no access for research, you can keep them. I'm not sure how much good they're doing in somebody's attic or basement. And then it could be passed on. And there are actually seminars that are given on how to preserve these items or how to pass it on to somebody else. But this, my talk is about giving it away. So here's some types of artifacts. Here's one type, this glossine and pressing oil. But other artifacts are clothing, curling irons, musical scores, all these that are in this list here, but anything that can be shaped by human craft. This tin of Madam Walker hair glossine I found in my aunt's apartment where she had lived for 50 years, had to clean out her apartment in 2010. Not the same home that you're going to hear me talk more about, but my aunt had attended the Madam Walker Beauty School here in Washington in the 1950s. I'll come back to that later. So this story, as I said, is primarily about some photographs we found. Photographs are considered manuscripts because they're paper. And these photos were donated to Northeastern University. I will tell you how they traveled from a house in East Columbia Heights, that's in DC, to an archives in Washington. The story began here in 2006. This is my cousin Connie, or I should say my mother's cousin Connie. Connie's grandmother was my mother's great grandmother. I'll show you an image later. And this is the house where she was living. This is the house. Well, what happened was my husband, Eric, and I ended up being power of attorney for Connie. Connie never married, never had any children. Her siblings were deceased when in 2006, she had a little episode that a lot of elderly people have, that many of us are gonna end up having too, where she just couldn't take care of herself anymore. And she said, nobody will help me. And we were sitting there with her social worker. My mother and Connie are in different generations, but they had become pretty good friends over the years. And my mother had become friends with the social worker. And this is the back of the social worker going into the house. This is actually a picture of the house after we cleaned it up and fixed it up. So it goes to show things can happen. But this house had been purchased by Connie's mother, Goldie Glover Bruce, in 1945. And she was a single woman. And as far as I can see, her deed or her loan, her mortgage was also a traditional mortgage. So when Goldie became ill in the 1970s, Constance came from New York, where she had been living for several years, to care for her mother. After Goldie died, Constance didn't do much fixing up and never threw anything away. How many of y'all know people like this? Most of us do. So this was a desk upstairs. The other thing is Connie was legally blind in her later years, although I'm not sure we can blame her blindness on the clutter. And I just want to mention that, see this plastic radio? I didn't know much about them at that time. And I think somebody came to the house one day and I was showing them to them. There were at least 5 plastic radios, one on this desk, some in the basement, apparently radios that Goldie and Connie had owned over the years. I'm just saying, later we learned that they have value. So if you ever come across them, have somebody take a look at them to determine the value, or take them to a consignment shop or something. Don't throw them away or give them away. More of their stuff. This is the dining room. This is the basement. They had papers and stuff from elementary school in the early 1900s. So as I said, the house had been purchased in 1945. This is Goldie and her then husband, Charles Bruce. This picture would have been taken about 1908. Goldie and Charles divorced about 1931. The photos were found in a red accordion folder in the basement among all this clutter. It wasn't proper storage, but we think that because the processing of the photos was silver gelatin, that might have been somewhat of a preservative. So here's some of the Bruce family photos on the wall at Manor Place. Here's Goldie, daughter Althea, daughter Constance, son Charles, and daughter Constance again. And here's Charles again, because we believe that he's the one who took the photos. Our lives crossed, but I never knew him. I met Althea. I met Goldie. She died in 1977, and I did not meet the son, Charles Bruce. Connie is the one I knew well. So another way that you can obtain family information or information about the items you find is by ordering personnel records. Because somehow I knew that Charles Bruce had worked for the Charlestown Navy Yard, which is a federal agency in Boston, I requested his personnel record. And I guess that's available through the Freedom of Information Act. And I don't know if that has changed since 2006 or so when I requested it. So his position was pattern maker. And after I found the pictures, I contacted Irene Whalen, owner of Zawadi Gallery in Washington. And actually I had contacted her coworker, Steve, who had a section of the Zawadi Gallery, Steve Barrow, called Pages from the Past. And when I contacted him, it was because I had all these letters and other documents, and I thought he would have some suggestion of what to do with those papers. At the time, I had no clue, believe it or not, of the historical value of these old photos. And so Irene said, well, Steve and Irene said, let's sell some of the photos at Zawadi during Black History Month. And subsequently, Irene had her publicist write up a press release, and sure enough, the Washington Post picked it up. And we think this, well, they took a couple of the photos, and we think this is actually Constance when she was a little girl. And of course, these are some Masons. And we were able to find separate information by doing a little research about the fact that in 1908, they had this huge Masons parade, and there had been these photographs of a parade that took place in Boston. So we think that the photos were taken at the time of this Masons parade in 1908. But this image, of course, if you're familiar with Masons, you see these kinds of images because the Masons have dressed up like this since their inception. And I'm talking about the Prince Hall chapter, Prince Hall Masons, the chapters across the United States. They've always dressed like this, but this was new to a lot of people, okay? And to see a little brown child having a tea party, some people haven't seen images like that. I hadn't seen too many of them, or at least hadn't tuned into them. So this scene is from the show we had at Zawadi. One of Aunt Goldie's diaries that we had found was on display. And we had found bundles and bundles and bundles of letters tied up with string. And by the way, that string survives decades, whereas rubber bands will disintegrate in what, a few months. Just keep that in mind if you're trying to conserve or preserve something. Look at this laptop we were using in 2000, and I guess it was 2007, we had this show. A lot of things have transpired and changed since then. So after the article ran in the Post, Irene, the owner or proprietor of the gallery, said she had never had so many inquiries about one of her gallery shows. And for me, I had no idea of the value and interest of early African-American photos. Black and white folks were interested in these photos. These are some of the people who attended the event. So at the show, somebody said, maybe more than one person said, don't sell the photos, save them as a collection. So thus began the process of authenticating, appraising, and seeking an institution in which to place the photos. Before then, like I said, I had no idea. And if Steve and Irene knew about the value of photos, well, they did in the sense that they knew that we could sell them, but who knew that there was an opportunity to place them in a repository? So I had seen this letter that Constance had written to her mother. Understand now, Constance, the letters that Constance wrote to her mother were all still in the house, okay? And so she had written, and I'm going to show you the transcription. She said, maybe you don't remember my telling you about being told to walk across the bridge with a fellow from fellowship meeting at Trinity one night. This character was quiet and assuming and liked to walk, always wore black and a black felt hat, and the kids said he always wore. Nothing much to look at. They thought it would be funny for us queer folks to walk home together. And queer is being used in whatever way Constance was using it back there. What year was it? 1948, okay. Probably not the same way as people use it today. But the person that was being referenced in the letter was Alan Rohan Cripe. He later came to be known as the Dean of Black Boston Artists. So I just remembered that because a few years prior to us finding these photos and other stuff, Eric and I had actually been in New York visiting a gallery, the Concalibur Gallery, where the proprietor there took us through the, I'll call it the basement, the storage area of his gallery, and showed us all these images about Alan Rohan Cripe. Otherwise, even this I probably wouldn't have really thought much of. But anyway, here's Alan Cripe and some of his works. He's standing in front of the art in one of the houses where he lived, the last house he lived, next to the last house. He eventually moved to a senior community, but in a house where he was living before he moved to the senior community, every piece of wall space had some of his art. And this is apparently a self-portrait. You know, most artists do self-portraits. We think Charles Bruce did self-portrait photography. So why did I want to locate Alan Cripe? Because in something I read about Alan Cripe, I read that he lived on Windsor Street. And also I had read that he had worked at the Charlestown Navy Yard. So I said, maybe there's a connection. Maybe he can help me learn more about Charles Bruce. And so I knew somebody in DC I knew somebody who knew Cripe or who knew somebody else who knew Cripe. And I wrote to him, and sure enough, his wife responded. This is his wife, who was 50 years younger than he, and she was eager to help. And if any of this sounds like fiction, it's not, this is the truth. So subsequently, Eric and I visited Boston. Jackie invited us to come up, and she was just so hospitable. She was wonderful. She took us to the Navy Yard. I showed us the exhibit about her husband. He was still living at the time, but he was pretty much bedridden. And he had been like an artist, draftsman. Charles Bruce had been a draftsman at the Navy Yard, but they were actually in different generations. You know, but when you start doing the research, you get a little bit mixed up. But this was helpful mix up because Jackie was able to really help. So here's a picture, probably a self-portrait of Charles Bruce with some of the patterns he made. So as pattern maker, he made models of parts that would later be tooled into full-size parts for a ship. And at the museum, the Charlestown Navy Yard Museum, he pulled back this canvas and showed us all these little patterns. Now, we didn't take time to try to match them to some of the images of the patterns that, like the one we see here. You know what, this was how many years ago, 15 years ago. I got to go back. There's always more work to be done. Sometimes I'm starting to think I am not going to get it all done in this lifetime, but I'm hoping. So while in Boston, we also visited the South End Historical Society, which is the general neighborhood where Charles Bruce had lived. Other steps to authenticating the photos were, we spoke to librarians at the Boston Public Library, actually talked to the photo historian. We visited the Boston Athenaeum, which is a, what do you call it, a fee-based library. We connected with distant family members. I already said we obtained Charles Bruce's civil service record, and we talked to other longtime Bostonians. So here's an image of some of my ancestors. Here's Goldie, who was Constance's mother. These are my, I always forget what you call them, second great grandparents, James Glover and Lucy Glover. And so in Connie and Goldie's house were letters that Lucy Ellen Taney Hill Cromwell, right here in the middle, had written to Connie. Lucy was quite a prolific writer. So I got in touch with Lucy. I wrote her a letter, and I think she subsequently either wrote me back or called me. Lucy lived, you hear me say lived, on Cape Cod. Lucy died in 2020. I'm so glad we connected before she died. But we visited Lucy. Lucy invited another of her cousins, my cousin too, but I had never met her. She wasn't on my radar. Meredith Hines Harris, who still lives in Cape Cod. And we met. So I'm descended from Betty Glover Garland. Lucy's descended from Carrie Glover Walton. And Meredith is descended from Elijah Glover. And we all had a copy of this photo. And the fact is, a copy of this photo had been on the wall in my mother's house, but it had never occurred to me until 2006 when I discovered all this stuff in Connie's house. Like, who were these people? Where are their descendants? How many of you were connected to the descendants of your great grandparents? Maybe we can discuss that later on. So Jackie Cricht and others led us to Lolita Parker Jr., a Boston photographer who had been contracting with Northeastern University, helping to document the Northeastern University neighborhood history. So Northeastern, like GW here in Washington, Georgetown, so on, and so many, Columbia and New York, are in communities that were once Black neighborhoods. So now they're eager to document that Black history, even though they kind of took some of the neighborhood away from us, but that's a complicated history as well. So I got in touch with Lolita. Lolita came to Washington to meet us and even interviewed Connie for the Northeastern University Oral History Project and put us in touch with the archivist at NEU. That archivist, and Joan Krizak, and I subsequently exchanged many emails to confirm the donation criteria. This is Connie. She was quite a character. She loved having her head covered. I actually usually do too. I wear hoodies all the time. Connie, when she was in a nursing home and later, like, she would have on her little hoodie or a cap like this. Sorry. Okay. So all the photos are now at the Northeastern University Library and Archives. And I'm going to show you another image of what the pictures look like on the website, because I don't want to click on there. I've learned that you can't see an outside image that I show when we're doing Zoom. So anyway, it was probably in 2006 that Eric and I were in New York visiting the exhibit Slavery in New York at the New York Historical Society. And while browsing the bookstore there, I came across some of Deborah Willis's books. I'm not going to talk too much about Deb Willis, but if you're not familiar with her, look her up. And that's where I saw similar kinds of images to what we had found. Like, who knew? These are not in the mainstream, okay? That maybe just in the last 10 or 15 years, we're seeing them more and more because they are coming out of people's attics and basements. And we have more and more African-American museums, right? So in this book were images that W.E.B. Du Bois had collected for the, what was it? The Paris Exposition. I forgot the year, but Deb turned it into a book. And I also met Deborah later, and this is one of her books titled Posing Beauty. And she acquired one of my photos, one of the Charles Bruce photos, and included it in her book. So I was really proud of that. So we're still working towards identifying and authenticating the people and places in the photos. Another time we were in Boston, actually at a Boston market food place on Mass Ave. If you all know Boston, you know Mass Ave a little bit, and most of you have heard of the Christian Science Church. I did not recognize this until we were on Mass Ave and saw that image, and I said, there it is. This picture also of the entire church, First Church of Christ Science, was a picture that Charles Bruce had taken. And this is it today. So you can see how there was still a lot of work yet to be done on the grounds. So here's 62 Prescott Street in Somerville, where Constance Bruce and her family lived in 1920. This is Constance, her sister Althea, and her brother. And this is the house in 2007 when Eric and I visited. So you see the stairwell is still basically the same. Here's 83 Windsor Street, where Charles Bruce's mother lived. This is a picture of Charles Bruce's mother. We're pretty sure based on some other evidence. And then here's what Windsor Street looks like today. That's one of the fun things about doing research on a place where some things just haven't changed. So Charles Bruce photographs at Northeastern University. I can't take you to the live site right now, but I will give a link to Michelle so that you can see it. And it says Charles Bruce photographs and who was the creator and so on, had some other information. It says they were purchased from Linda Critchlow White, September 30th, 2009. So I still like to say I donated them because they did not pay the appraised value. So we could still use that difference between the appraised value and what they gave me as a tax deduction. And who likes to give money to Uncle Sam? So it's nice to be able to give things away. And the money that I received from Northeastern was basically enough to pay me shall I say, reimburse me for what I had paid people to help me organize the photos and clean them up and pay for the appraisal and such. Okay, so all of the photos are available to view on the website. And when you get ready to donate something, you will have some kind of agreement, an offer to purchase initially, or an offer to receive the materials, and then an official agreement. So make sure you do get that. Don't just say here, or don't just drop things off at an institution. So how did we identify Charles Bruce as a photographer? His stamp was on the back of some of the photos. And his surviving child, Constance, did say the photography had been his avocation. And we mainly identified him by this notation on the back of an 1891 photo, because he didn't change much over the years. And this little photo had been in a little frame. And initially we didn't even take it out. So I'm just saying, these are the things you have to do when you find stuff. And it said that this was a picture. It was a tintype, and it was Herbie, also known as Charles Herbert Bruce. Herbert was his middle name. So here's that Bruce family again. So a little more background information. Goldie had been born in Lynchburg in 1889, and she was my great-great aunt, sister to my great-great-grandmother. I already showed you some of these people. Betty was my direct ancestor. Another thing that we found in the house among the stuff was a copy, it was initially handwritten, but I transcribed it, a copy of a letter that Goldie had written describing her ancestry, how her mother had been enslaved at Appomattox, which I knew was where General Lee surrendered to General Grant. A lot of people still don't know that. But as a school librarian, one of the responsibilities I had soon after I started, this was in 2004. I came to library science late in life, but I was asked to work on something called a Civil War scrapbook. I had to read everything about the Civil War for this lesson. And I can't say that I would have or would not have known about it otherwise, but this helped. This really sparked an aha moment. My people were at Appomattox. And so here again is my great-grandmother, Lucy Glover, Betty Glover, her daughter. This is my grandmother, Florence Garland Stevens, who died before I was born. So I did not know my maternal grandmother. And this is my aunt, Edna Stevens McIntyre. And I have to update this. She was born in 1917 and she died in 2017. Got to put that on there. But she was enslaved by Wilmer McLean. He's the man in whose house General Lee surrendered to General Grant. I think they look just alike, but I haven't proven that connection. I do know that they were enslaved by him and his wife, but that's another story for another day. So I've been to Appomattox a few times since then to research the connection. Mind you, I didn't know anything about the Appomattox connection until 2007. So here is a cousin, my cousin Carolyn Brown. She's my mother's first cousin who still lives in Lynchburg, Virginia, because a lot of the family, when they left Appomattox, they went to Lynchburg down the road. So here we are talking to one of the park, actually it's the park historian. Snow on the ground. It was in April, but I remember it was cold. And this is an exhibit that was at the Lynchburg Legacy Museum, an African-American museum in Lynchburg, that actually had a picture of my ancestors. This coincidentally happened right around the same time I was having this aha moment up here in DC. And my cousin Carolyn had sent me some of the information, so I went down to see that as well. And in the museum, there was also a blurb that cousin Carolyn had provided about the people who had been enslaved at Appomattox, as well as at Manassas. If any of you know that story, the Civil War began in Manassas and Wilmer McLean was at Manassas. They say the Civil War began in his front yard and ended in his backyard. Because after the Battle of First Manassas, Wilmer McLean took his family, said, we're getting out of here. We're going southwest where we don't have to deal with cannonballs and such. Went to Appomattox, and ironically, in 1865, when Lee and Grant were looking for a place to sign whatever papers they had to sign, they ended up at Wilmer McLean's house. Almost seemed like it was planned. I don't know. But anyway, here's the Lynchburg Legacy Museum. And here's cousin Carolyn and me talking to the park historian in April 2013. So here's some more facts that I learned in the house. The Glover family moved from Lynchburg to Boston in 1901, and they lived in the neighborhood now known as the South End or Lower Roxbury. Oops. And I knew that from a postcard that was in the house. There were many postcards, though. And we can see the postmark, 1907. This is actually a card that Yarby, also known as Herbie, Charles Herbert Bruce, sent to Goldie. So he couldn't pick up his phone and call her and say, I'm coming to visit. He sent her a card. I don't know how long it took the card to get there, how much advance notice he had to give her, but interesting stuff we learn when we find stuff. So we are sure that the majority of these photos were taken in Boston. Here's the Navy Yard, here's the South End house again. Also in the house was a ledger. She had kept track of all of her expenses. And this is 1932, just after her divorce, around 1931. Some more facts, but we're up to 1943 now. Another piece of paper that we found in the house where she had written about herself, her life story, so to speak. And I think she had been asked to do this because they must have been having some kind of a program like a This Is Your Life, you'll remember that, at Slough Hall where she was working. A little bit more about Slough Hall in the next slide. And help me watch the time as well. And so Goldie left Boston about 1935 and went to Tennessee, where Charles Bruce Jr., her son, who also happened to be Harvard grad class of 1933, and there's a whole nother story there. He was teaching engineering at Tennessee A&I, now Tennessee State University, and she took a job as a nursing assistant in the school infirmary. And then she moved to Washington somewhere around 1942. We think she moved to Washington to take a temporary government job at the beginning of World War II, as so many other women did. She did have some other relatives who had already settled in DC, including a niece, a nephew, and two grandnieces, one of whom was my mother, Marietta Stevens Critchlow. So she worked in Slough Hall as like a dorm matron. At that time, Slough Hall was a dormitory for Negro government girls. Remember now, while we Black folks did have the opportunity to work in the federal government, but this special housing was still segregated. And this image was on the back of the envelope. And I just love this because it says the capital's most distinctive hotel for women. And of course, Lucy Diggs Slough Hall is named after the woman who was the first dean of women at Howard University. And there's another book that was written maybe about 10 years ago titled Lipstick Brigade, about the World War II government girls. And in that book, she talks about the places where the girls lived. She does note that they were the whites only dorms and the colored dorms for the colored girls. And she says that these colored dorms, like it says the Northeast, that was the name of one of the colored dorms, and Lucy Slough Hall, they were similar, but lacked the impressive amenities of the larger complexes. But on the envelope that I found in Connie's house, it said, this was the capital's most distinctive hotel for women. You see how we adapted? See that different perspective? So there was a newsletter in the house, Slough Hall Snooper. So much we learned. And so it's not known exactly why Goldie left Slough Hall, but apparently it was somewhere around 1945 when she purchased the house on Manor Place. She purchased it for $5,000. There were diaries in the house and so much more. And I already told you, we were told, don't sell the photos. So after we decided to donate them, or to try to donate them, we decided to have them appraised. One photography specialist that was referred to me was Marie Martin. Her name might still be on the Library of Congress website. They do have a list of appraisers there. And I'd love to know how many of you have experience with appraisers. The other really important thing is to prepare an inventory. And I call this a preliminary inventory. Because once an institution receives the donation, they're going to create their own inventory. But for me, I wanted to know what I was giving away. Now, if you're cleaning out somebody else's house, you might say, I just got to get rid of this quickly. I'm going to donate it and not worry about that. But I did have a couple of young teenage friends, also another young college friend, help me with sorting them and creating the inventory. I was still working as a school librarian also, and I had some of my students to help me scan the images. And we organized them into these groups. And actually, Steve Farrow at Zawadi helped me come up with these categories. This is not technical. This is just what we decided to call them. So I told you about Crite and how we made that link. So more about the inventory. You got to organize, make a list, scan the photos and or documents, and research the material. Once you go to an appraiser, he will tell you, because the appraiser has to give a report of the material that ultimately goes to the IRS if you take it as a tax deduction. So the appraisers will tell you that if you do some of this research, it will save you money. Makes sense. So a little bit more about artifacts. We also donated some things to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This was about 2010. And one of the nice things is they gave me a DVD with all of these images with a nice label and everything after I donated. And it's listed on the museum website, this tin of Madam Walker hair glossine. And these are some additional things that we found in my aunt's apartment. Here's my aunt with, this was at a graduation program for the Madam Walker Beauty School in 1957 here in DC. Plus, she had saved all the receipts for which she had paid $10 a week for her lessons. And at the time, my aunt was also working full-time at the Bureau of Engraving here in DC. And here's just an aside. I gave a talk about HBCUs to a group of people who know very little about HBCUs. And I included this image because really we have to recognize that hairdressers, beauticians, cosmetologists, whatever, they were actually a very important part of, let's call it moving up. We know that these women were not receiving the same kind of degrees as at Hampton Howard or even a Harvard or Ohio State, where Black folks were really attending, but they created their own system and they really helped to build up the Black community. And so fast forward to 2018, we donated family papers to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard Radcliffe. These were still many of the same papers that we had found at Connie's house. But mind you, it took a while to get to all this. When we found everything, I knew that photos were valuable. So I wanted to get them out of the house and into a repository. And we did that successfully. Most of the rest of the stuff stayed in boxes in our house until after 2013, when I retired and was able to devote more attention to it. And then, as it is noted here, Asala national president, who was actually, she was national president in 2018, she helped to facilitate this donation. By the way, now this picture was not in Connie's house. This is a photo album that belonged to another, one of my Chrysler aunts. Her name was Martha Archer Critchlow Grant. Aunt Martha had this wonderful scrapbook. And you see her name. She attended this school called Brick College. It was like a junior college in Bricks, North Carolina, named after a man named Joseph Brick. And like many of our HBCUs, was named Joseph Brick, was a white man who helped us, so to speak. But I love that picture because it just shows people having a good time. And so often when we think about 1930s in North Carolina, we think about subjugation, deprivation, but that was not always the case. So more broad appraising. Here's a man, Alan Stipak, at Second Story Books here in DC, who did our appraisal. And these are boxes and bags that I took him to take a look at. An appraiser has to at least lay eyes on the material, even if he doesn't go through everything page by page. So one of the things that happened was I had an impromptu meeting, I'll call it, with Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. We were both attending an Asala event here in DC. And I overheard her mention something about her grandfather, who was, I'm going to forget his name. His last name was Brooks, Reverend Walter Brooks. He was a very prominent pastor at 19th Street Baptist Church here in DC. And I heard her say that name. And then I said to her, you know, I just came across an article from the Washington Post or Star or something that my mother had kept about your grandfather. And subsequently she said, well, what else do you have? Because I guess she said, if this woman has an article from 1941 about a person with no obvious connection to her or her family, maybe she has other stuff. And so when she said, what else do you have? I sat down and made a list. So this is part of what I mean by the who, how, what, when, and where. What do you have? Who are these people? When were they born? When did they die? And what else do you have? So that's the preliminary inventory. So Dr. Higginbotham said that the Schlesinger at Radcliffe, the former Women's College of Harvard, but it's now combined. They were in the process, and this is ongoing, collecting papers of African-American women. Dr. Higginbotham said the Schlesinger had lots of materials from liberal white women, but very little from conservative white women or African-American women. So she made it sound like they would be glad to have these papers that I had. So after some, back and forth again, those papers ended up there. So this is the website. Again, this is not live, but I will send the web link to Michelle to share with all of you. And it lists some of the many things that are now there. They're not digitized on their website yet, but at least there is the list of the things that we donated. So now, how do you decide? You have to consider, again, the who, what, why, where, and when, the type and content of the manuscripts, the scope of the repository, the capacity and interest of the repository or library. Of course, this is the Library of Congress, and they have a lot of papers of both Black and white folks, just so you'll know. Can't go into detail today, but at Howard, there's the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. I want to venture to say all libraries have forms of archives, and I encourage you to, if you have materials to donate, check with your local schools and libraries and repositories. Explore the repository options and the history of the repository, their values, their affiliations. Consider the geographic location. Now, to be honest, having the papers, a lot of our papers in Boston, I don't want to say it's problematic, but it's potentially problematic to me. But I felt it was a good fit because the Glover family had been in Boston. Plus, I'm hoping that, there's such a outstanding research community there. Hopefully at some point they will make good use of some of those materials. And the part about presence of similar collections. So in terms of the things that are now at Radcliffe, they have a whole collection of women. And the other thing that I have been intending to emphasize here, the people in my family were ordinary people. These were not the movers and shakers, although at Radcliffe, they do have the papers of some very, very notable African-American and other women. But my people were ordinary people, but everybody has a story. And one day when somebody wants to know about ordinary women, they might come across our family papers. You might want to visit the repository. You might want to assess the environment. And then you might get an offer from them after you let them know what you have, but then there will likely be some negotiation involved. So you have to negotiate the gift deed. And this is one document from the Society of American Archivists. I will send this to Michelle to share with you. The bottom line is you want to be careful what you throw away because your family memorabilia might help set the record straight. Remember, materials will be handled with care and properly stored. Future availability for research is assured, we hope. Materials are accessible to researchers and scholars, and the materials are out of your house, freeing your attics, basements, and your mind. Here are some links, and I will send them also to Michelle and Jania to share with you. Thank you very much for joining us this Sunday afternoon.
Thank you so much, Linda. Wow, wow, wow. So much information. I know I've seen this presentation before, but you've added so much. So thank you for adding more and enlightening our group today. I said I was going to do it, so I'm going to give some more shout outs. I believe I said South Carolina is here, Texas, Ohio, Massachusetts, New York, Florida, New Jersey, Kentucky, Maryland, Arizona, New York, Philadelphia, and the list goes on. So thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining us from either AARP or ASALH. We appreciate it. And thank you for joining us with questions. So I wanted to say, you talked about Lucy Diggs Sloat. She's a prominent woman in my sorority. I had to get the shout out.
All right.
So yes, I do know a lot about her, even before your presentation. So thank you for that and putting her in there. And I want to start asking questions. We have two so far. And one says, this is from Janelle, how did you decide which museum or library to donate items to?
So in the case of Northeastern, where we donated the photos, because I had made that connection with Lolita in Boston, who already had the Northeastern connection and who knew the archivist there and put me in touch with the archivist and vice versa, I just felt like it would be a reasonable fit. And I was anxious to get them out of my house. So just a warning again, you might not, if you have materials to donate, you might not want to donate them to the first place that asks. Do some research. So does that answer your question, Janelle?
Janelle, if it answered your question, let us know. Perfect. Thank you so much. Denise says, great presentation, Linda. What did you learn about conserving such old photos?
Well, to conserve old photos, there are some special things you have to do. And that's kind of a topic for another presentation. But, I have learned over time that they should be kept in a cool, dry place and non-acidic materials, whether it's a folder or plastic sleeve or what have you. A lot of times we have photos, remember the peel pages? Those photo albums where you peel it back, they said that's the absolute worst thing, right? And
yes, I've heard
yet
that.
all of these photos were stacked right next to each other, on top of each other, in a red accordion folder in a damp basement. So they had not been properly stored. But again, I didn't feel that they should stay in our house. I felt that they would be better in an institution that is climate controlled. I had scanned images and they're on the Northeastern website. And I know people like to hold on to things. And to be honest, I do still have stuff here that I need to get rid of. I'm still working on it, okay? Because one of the things that I want to do, I like to scan things and document before I give them away. And that takes time. So
it does. It really does. And I unfortunately have a stack over here that I'm supposed to be putting into some type of order. I'll get to it, hopefully. One thing that you did say, and I want to just emphasize this, because as I get older, I am finding that I'm glad that I have written on the back of the photo the name and the date, because I always say, well, where was I? Or what did I do? So I put it on the back, I put it in the corner. So just in case something like they find out that the pen that I'm using, bleeds through in 50 years, I put it on the corner so that, just in case it does bleed through, we can still see who it is and what the photo is about. So always label your photos.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so you said that. So because I think your aunt labeled the photo. So when she flipped it over, you were able to see that it was from a particular person and things of that nature. So wonderful.
Some of them. Most of those Charles Bruce photos did not have labels on them. And
okay.
Most of the photos we think are not relatives. We understand that Charles Bruce went around the community. This is 1908, mind you, and it was an avocation. In fact, someone has asked me, did I have his camera? No, but I have an image of a camera. One of those that you put the hood on and this big camera on a stand and so on. Most of those we don't know, but every now and then some piece of information like the Christian Science Church, will pop up. And then at least one of the images when I was cleaning up my mother's stuff, a whole nother story, found an identical photo. And on the back, it had his stamp, Charles Bruce.
Wow.
But I would
Okay.
not have known who they were had I not, because it didn't have the people's names. But I had spoken to another relative who I only met after 2006, who was able to identify them.
All right. Well, thank you, Linda. Another question comes in. How do you get started? You mentioned paying someone to help in organizing. How did you find that someone?
So, very good question. One of the things I did, I think you heard me say I was recent to library science. I was a home economics teacher until 2004. Well, I started library school in 2001, continued to teach home economics until I finished library school in 2003. And anyway, to answer the question, I was still on a listserv for a Catholic university. And I put a message out saying, I'm looking for somebody to help me with these photos. And sure enough, got a response. And that would have been at least 5 or 6 years ago. And do you know that woman still helps me with some stuff? She graduated in December last year. And she has a job now, but she says she's still available to help me. You know, when it's about typing lists and sorting and scanning. So I also realized that I had a teenage neighbor who was able to help me. Okay. The other thing, I did use some professional organizers who can be kind of, and I'm going to use the word expensive, but it's all relative. They help me with some things. Like there's actually such a thing as a professional photo organizer.
Really?
So it was a whole box of my mother's stuff. Actually, I'm saying a box. It probably was 2 or 3 boxes where at some point had fallen. And so stuff in the boxes was all mixed up. And also my mother all the way up until she was in her 90s, used a computer, and she had a printer that had a copy, a scanner. She never learned to scan, but she could make copies. You understand?
Right. Yeah.
Make copies of the old photos.
Yes.
I guess planning to send them to people.
Yeah.
Not that the people necessarily wanted them, but although sometimes because people knew my mother had a lot of stuff and they'd go to her house. Marietta, would you make a copy of this picture for me? But she had many duplicates. And of course, this printed copies were just on regular paper. So they were not as good as the original, but she had all these duplicates. So I had a photo organizer come to the house and she could identify immediately, this is duplicate, so it's almost like shuffling, playing cards. And she could sort them really, really fast and help me decide how are we going to categorize these. And so that was helpful.
Well, I do see in the chat where Janaea put a PDF in there about downsizing and decluttering. If you want some information about that, that's in the chat. And we'll also send that out with Linda's information in the next few days. And then we have from Melinda. She says, love Linda Critchlow White, so enlightening, great job, always interesting knowledge found in ancestors' documents. The only way people could prove they paid for something back, let's see, it skipped. The only way people could prove they paid for something back in time was a receipt on paper. My father had so many in a small metal box. I found one paper where my brother's hospital bill was $52 in 1954. Cheap compared to today's medical costs. You're right about that. People are saying great information. I did see a question in the chat. Let's see. It was from Pamela. Should you be selective as to what to donate if the collection is massive? I literally have 3,000 to 4,000 letters from 1870 to 2003.
So to try to answer that, a lot of it would be up to the repository. The first thing I recommend is that you read the letters, that you, what can I say? I had most of Goldie's diaries and most of, not Goldie's letters, but some of the letters to Goldie transcribed. I wanted them transcribed so that if I'm trying to remember something I saw, I could search. Okay. Now, even that technology has changed just in the last 2 years. So it's very easy, but I actually paid some people. Again, these were my inexpensive friends, to maybe $20 an hour to transcribe. And why am I saying that? You want to know what's in the letters, okay? But and what's the name of the person again? I saw that message too, but now I'm not seeing it. I would love
Let's see it. I think, let me scroll back up. Pamela Birch.
I would love to be in touch with her. So if you could put your information in the chat, and I can't write it down right this minute, but maybe somebody could make note of it. Because I just think that's fascinating. You have all those letters from the 1800s. And I think somebody wrote a book titled Aunt Aydah's Diary. In fact, I can see it from here. When it was published a few years ago, and I don't think you're going to be able to see it unless I change my background. Bear with me for a minute. Nope, that doesn't do it. Wait a minute. Bear with me. Maybe I don't even have to release it. Virtual background. This is taking too long. I want to say none so that you can see the title of this book. But this is not the only one that's been done like this. So this is titled Aunt Aydah's Diary. And someone had found a diary here in Washington from during World War I. And she transcribed the pages and put them in a book, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that can be done. And I am still hoping to possibly do that with some of Aunt Goldie's materials. Were you able to see that image, or was it?
We weren't, but that's okay.
Oh, good.
We can send
So
the image to us, take a picture. We'll put that in the information.
Yes,
Again.
but these documents, or I mean, these kinds of publications are the work of scholars. Although this one, Aunt Aydah's Diary, this was not done by a scholar. It was done by somebody kind of like me, who found something and decided that it was worth sharing with others. And I'm thinking that, maybe collectively at some point, we can talk about, we could publish something, whether it's on a website, a blog, or whatever. And I know lots and lots of people who have found fascinating things in their relative's basement or attic. And that's why I like to share this story, because other people are finding stuff, but they don't necessarily know what to do with it. And if somebody has thousands of letters, I just think that is fascinating. And we lament the fact sometimes that our ancestors kept all this stuff, but if they hadn't kept it, we wouldn't be able to tell their stories. And I have another friend who found some stuff, and she said they knew, meaning the ancestors knew, that we would be telling their story one day. And they left the evidence
for us.
For us. Yes. And today we're throwing so much stuff away. And, like Michelle, you have lots of papers, whether it's your professional work, your ASALH work, your AARP work, those papers need to be donated. I'm not sure if institutions accept papers of living people. That's one more thing to investigate. But it'd be easier to donate them on an ongoing basis instead of waiting until you're gone and have your son have to figure out what to do with it.
Well, Linda Lambert, I'm sorry, Lillian Lambert, she donated her her Howard.
That's Harvard.
Her business information to Harvard. So I do believe that you can do that. That's something to look into.
Right.
I have one more question, and then we'll close this out. And people are still saying, great job. Thank you so much. I see sometimes things are on loan to a museum. Do you get money do they pay you if it's on loan, or do you just loan it to them?
I don't know. Okay. That would be up to the institution. So I know, for instance, here in DC, a couple of years ago, it was a joint, I'm going to say ownership, I might be using the wrong term, between Library of Congress and the National Museum of African American History and Culture of some photographs. And they're actually now back at the Library of Congress, but I don't know who paid for them originally. I can't even tell you at this moment where they originally came from. But often that happens. But I'm pretty sure that let's say somebody at the Schlesinger decides to lend some of my papers to another institution. I'm not even sure they have to let me know. But one of the things I have been intending to do, and I've done part of this, but I want to give the Schlesinger the names of my children, of some other younger relatives in particular. Like if there's a time you can't reach me, contact them. Not so much to compensate them for something, but just so that we still kind of have a record
Sure.
of where and what is being done with the materials. Even if somebody decides to do research with them, you know,
Right?
I might not know, but it would be nice to know.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Linda. I'm checking one more time. I don't see any more questions, but those are great questions. Thanks for being interactive with us today. I want to thank AARP Virginia again for sponsoring our Sunday sit-ins, and they've been a wonderful sponsor over the past couple of years, and I want to thank them. I can't thank them enough. So again, I'm going to say thank you. And so Asala Richmond, Virginia, we have every month as well a series on, it's called Cultivate. And this, I put the link in the chat if you would like to register. Our Cultivate event is on Africulture. It says what Black farmers need, addressing the realities and myths about Black farmers. That will be our Cultivate series on this Tuesday coming up at 7 o'clock. If you would like to know more information about Asala Richmond, please like our Facebook page and go in the link here, and we'll put it in a link when we email you our Asala sign up so that you can get our future events. We will also place in that information the history in our homes, where Linda Critchlow White also talked about this presentation, and it was a shorter presentation, and we'll have this one as well. I think that's it. It's 6:17. We're going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, just send us an email. We appreciate you being here today, and join us next month as we will have another Sunday sit-ins before our summer break, and we will start back up in September. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Janaea. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.